The robot left behind its own relics. It pats its companion's body. Finally, it slowly walks into the sea, ending its own life. What kind of experience could make a robot feel sadness and even despair? This robot is called No. 2. It is the second experimental machine of AI expert George, although its intelligence level is equivalent to that of a 15 or 16-year-old human. It is a capable assistant in George's daily work. In this era of rapid technological advancement, everything is shifting towards intelligence and automation. Even death has become less frightening. After death, a person can upload their consciousness data to a black box to communicate with family again through the cloud. Not long ago, George and his wife Jules were traveling when they unexpectedly encountered a car accident. Thus, the two were separated by death. But George has no time to grieve. His boss Simone has already been pushing him to work. In 2.5 years, George has only created Machine No. 1 and Machine No. 2. Among them, Machine No. 1's intelligence level is only equivalent to that of a 5 or 6-year-old child. Its favorite thing is to watch cartoons, so it was discarded by George early on. To this day, it has not been equipped with arms. Simone urged George to quickly deliver the robotic pet project. He can temporarily stop researching intelligent robots. George reluctantly agrees. After ending the video call, Machine No. 2 quietly said bad things about Simone. This brings George a lot of emotional value, so he also starts talking bad about his boss. At the same time, George meticulously wipes the screen of Machine No. 2, but he fails to notice that after he leaves, Machine No. 2 will spontaneously comfort Machine No. 1. This clearly exceeds the robot's programming. He only cares about the No. 3 robot he is currently building. This is a fully humanoid robot. He wants to write Jules' consciousness data into the program, and all of this is witnessed by No. 2. But at this moment, the laboratory suddenly loses power. George can only go out with No. 2 to fix it. During this time, No. 2 shows concern for him, and it believed that the two are family. No. 2 hopes to help him, but all it gets in return is George's indifference and scolding. At this time, No. 2 shows a sense of loss similar to that of a human. George has no time to care about that. He is completely immersed in building No. 3, but an accident occurs during the first startup. George works late into the night because of this. He continuously analyzes Jules' consciousness data, but at some point, the laboratory's security system is breached, resulting in the door being unable to close. Various emergencies have occurred recently. George suspected that No. 2 is causing trouble, so he scolds it loudly. George tells it that he will get it a better set of legs soon. Then George ignores any explanation and leaves directly. At this moment, 2 black box security inspectors arrive at the laboratory. George quickly hides the 2 robots. Only then does he go to greet them. During the subsequent questioning, George stated that Jules could call in any time, but he can't call her, and sometimes there are instances of silence. At this time, the inspectors discover there are signs that the black box has been opened, and there are some illegal patches in the program. According to relevant laws, they have the right to directly confiscate the black box, and even to enforce this by force. But George wants to classify them as armed intruders, in the name of the company. One of the inspectors smiles and compromises. Then they leave the laboratory with their equipment. After they leave, No. 3 enters a new debugging phase. It still shows some abnormalities. George is about to shut it down, but is stopped by it. So he lets No. 3 vent its frustrations, but George is quite satisfied with this. He can finally sleep peacefully, and afterward, he continues to enhance its abilities, to give it a sense of taste, but in the subsequent empathy test, it performs worse than No. 2. At this moment, No. 1 walks in, seeing its missing arm. No. 3 becomes suspicious of George. After all, it also lacks legs. George assures it that in a few days, he will prepare a set of high-end legs for it, but he is completely unaware that No. 2 is watching everything from the monitors. A few days later, George goes out alone to repair the laboratory equipment. He suddenly receives a message from No. 3, but George doesn't pay attention to it, until he notices something unusual through the telescope. When George returns to the laboratory, facing No. 2, which wants to help him, George is not gentle like before. Instead, he starts blaming No. 2 for being a nuisance. It's just that the laboratory's power supply is malfunctioning. The despised No. 2 stared at Jules' portrait, not knowing what it is thinking. One day, George claims he is going out for a meeting. He goes to a nightclub. Here, George met a risk assessor. The assessor told George that he himself is a risk, and was currently under surveillance. Then there were a bunch of nonsensical words. George wanted to turn and leave, but the other person pulled out a gun, then handed him a box, saying, This is the latest security protocol, and told him to stay away from tuna. George just thought the person was crazy, but when he returned home, George found that the floor-to-ceiling windows of his house had been damaged. George carefully explored every corner with a stick. However, he found nothing. When the lights returned to normal, the first thing George thought of was to check on No. 3, but when George arrived in the room, he found that No. 3 had actually disappeared. George immediately opened the box. The entire room was instantly sealed. Inside the box was actually a set of firearms, and a video call from that expert. George ignored it. He drove out directly to search for No. 3, but everything around him was pure white. Even with a telescope, there were no signs of life, so George could only search with a drone. But this area was just too vast. Even the drone couldn't see the end. At this moment, George started to hallucinate. Jules unexpectedly appeared beside him. It was a memory of when they were together. At the same time, it revealed that the black box wasn't true storage, but a simulation, so it could only be used for 200 hours. However, during this process, the other party would have no awareness that it was simulated data. This led to an argument between Jules and George, because she didn't want to die in the box. In the end, George agreed not to use this technology on Jules. George couldn't find No. 3. He could only return to the laboratory in disappointment. At this time, he remembered No. 2 again. George calls it family. He lets it help him with various tasks, and George continues his search. Eventually, he finds No. 3 in the cabinet, but now she is extremely angry. No. 2 has implanted Jules' memories into her, so No. 3 recalls everything from the past. It knows that George has deceived it. In this situation, George finally tells No. 3 the truth. He doesn't want to lose Jules. After calming it down, he angrily approached No. 2 and questioned why it was doing this. No. 2 has developed real emotions at some point. It is jealous of No. 3. It wants to be by George's side, but George is unwilling to hear this explanation. George forcefully shuts No. 2 down, and then removes its legs. After careful polishing and adjustment, he replaced them with No. 3, and completely upgrades and remakes it, turning it from a model machine into a true humanoid robot. From a distance, it looks no different from a normal human, but the advanced legs promised to No. 2 are instead made up of old leg parts pieced together. No. 3 strolls along the mountainside and lakeside with these legs, feeling the beauty of nature. But No. 2, with these old legs, struggles to maintain even the simplest movements, and George continues to deceive it, constantly making promises that he will soon replace No. 2's legs, but he won't even mention a specific time frame. No. 2 quietly walks away. It stares at the waterfall, lost in thought, until its power is nearly depleted. Ultimately, No. 2 collapses in the laboratory hallway. Meanwhile, George received the notification, but he doesn't pay any attention to it. George is still chatting and enjoying food with No. 3, until No. 1 discovered the fallen No. 2. This is what finally interrupts George, but when faced with the waking No. 2, George heard it say that it is not good, but he is unwilling to listen any longer. George simply tosses it aside. He is completely unaware of the changes happening to No. 2. It seems to have acquired something called a heart. Afterward, No. 3 takes over the daily tasks of No. 2. It can even accompany George in doing more things, running together and even dancing together. All of this is seen by No. 2. Seeing their cheerful appearances, No. 2 chooses to leave. It leaves behind its favorite books and toys. Then it strokes No. 1. No. 2 seems to be saying a final goodbye. It comes alone to the seaside, gazing at the vast ocean. No. 2 resolutely walks in. The water engulfs its head. Ultimately, it disappears without a trace. After No. 2 goes missing, George begins to worry, but he only watched the monitors in the lab. It's unclear if he truly worries about No. 2's safety, or if he fears the exposure of illegal research. After a brief fruitless search, George prepares a funeral for it. He buries all of No. 2's belongings. In the end, only No. 1 quietly stays there. After No. 2 leaves, No. 3 looked in the mirror and discovered that she resembles Jules. Coincidentally, at this moment, George also dreamed of the wonderful time he spent with his wife again. He almost treats No. 3 as his wife, but when George turns and sees its figure, he is startled and jumps up. George shouts angrily for it to get out. No. 3 is confused. All her memories come from Jules, but George does not accept this. So who exactly is she? The program is running intensely. She lets out a painful scream. In the midst of intense thinking, No. 3 faints and crashes. When she wakes up again, she is already in the research facility. She recalls some details of the accident. At that time, George was covered in blood, and she was already pregnant. Meanwhile, George was informed by the black box administrator that due to component aging, he has only one chance left to talk to his wife. George recalls the two inspectors from before. They had said the components were functioning normally, but the administrator told him that the company has no records of any site visits, and that those two people didn't exist at all. But there is no time for him to ponder this. Simone calls again. She berates George for his illegal research. The black box company has found the lost No. 2 and obtained relevant experimental record data. Seeing the situation is dire, he grabbed an axe and rushed out of the laboratory. George destroys the switch for the entrance bridge of the lab, and No. 3 who stayed in the laboratory found that there was an inexplicable sound coming from around. It turned out to be a call from the black box. On the other end is the real Jules, but at this moment, George returned. He hurriedly goes over to answer the call. George told Jules that they will soon be able to see each other again. This raises No. 3's suspicion. Then George finally reveals his true intention. He wants to rewrite No. 3's program, using her as a vessel for Jules' memories, even if this will completely erase her. During their conversation, the black box company's aircraft has already arrived at the laboratory. Because George has fallen out with the company, he has lost control of the laboratory. No. 3 looked at the armed robot gradually approaching on the monitor. She picks up the gun from the box. At this moment, No. 1 steps forward, but its programming is insufficient to act. George finally admits his selfish motives. He wants to use all this to make up for his past mistakes. No. 3 has ultimately inherited Jules' consciousness data. She can't harm George. No. 3 can only give up her consciousness and lie there. As the machinery gradually descends, the laboratory's door is being cut from the outside. Meanwhile, the robotic arm injects a large amount of data into No. 3's brain. She lets out a heart-wrenching scream, but George only cares about whether the experiment is successful. He sees that No. 3 has not woken for a long time. George picks up the gun, ready to fight, but as the laboratory door opens, there is nothing outside. The entire test area seems to have been deserted. George shows a look of confusion. Just then, No. 3 finally awakens. His experiment has succeeded. Before they have a chance to celebrate, the black box rings again, but the data has already been destroyed. No. 3 repeatedly urges him not to answer the call, but after a brief hesitation, he still opens the black box. On the other end, he is told that the system is about to expire. It turns out that in that accident, it was George who died, not Jules. In the end, he heard his daughter's voice. At this moment, George remembers everything. At the end of the film, Jules and her daughter received the file containing George's data from those two inspectors. The film ends here. Archive was released in 2020 and portrayed the rapidly advancing artificial intelligence in an exaggerated way. The film tells the story of the life between human George and 3 robots. As a human, George displays a more cold-blooded, selfish, and utilitarian nature. In contrast, the distinctly different No. 2 robot exhibits more emotional variability and humanity. This inevitably prompts reflection on how we should confront in the near future artificial intelligence that is nearly indistinguishable from humans, and even superior to humans. Are they truly loving family members, or merely simple components? Well, that concludes this episode. Thank you all for watching. Your likes, comments, and follows are the best encouragement for us. See you next time.